Hi everyone, very nice to see you all. Thanks for making the effort to come and join us this morning, and thank you to Jonathan and Jan for a really interesting and thought-provoking first session, and I'm sure we'll touch on some of those themes in the next half an hour. By way of introduction, my name's Harry. I'm a partner in the corporate team here at Mitchells, and I'm also a member of the consumer brands team. An area of focus for myself and many of my colleagues is helping scale up consumer brands in their journey towards scaling. So helping them with various sorts of funding rounds and then hopefully all the way through to a successful exit. And one of the businesses we helped support on that journey was Mindful Chef. And we're really grateful to Rob for joining us this morning. And he'll be sharing his experiences of scaling a D2C successfully all the way through to a recent exit. Before I sort of invite Rob to share his thoughts, I thought I'd just sort of, for those of you who may not be as familiar with Mindful Chef, just share a few sort of bits of information, statistics that he might be too sort of modest to share himself, or maybe not, I don't know. So Rob founded the business back in 2015 with two school friends after a summer selling fish directly to locals from a small fishing boat on the ex-estuary in Devon. Since then, gone over and sold over 35 million meals, which is quite an achievement. They've won Specialty Online Retailer of the Year, a record 4 times, I gather, at the Grocer Awards. First recipe box globally to become a B Corp, and I think now ranked in the top 3% of food B Corps worldwide. They've donated more than 20 million meals to children in poverty. Since being founded in 2015, have gained investment from several hundred individuals through the Crowdcube and Seeders platforms, and then also through Piper, Series A round, who are a specialist consumer VC. And then back in 2020 became part of the Nestle group. So sort of quite a journey. Have I missed anything that you want to cover there?
No, very good.
Okay, good. He told me to say all those things. So, Rob, good to have you here. Thanks for joining us. I've just touched on a few of the achievements that you and the business have been through since you set it up all those years ago. But to start, maybe if you just take us back to 2015, and what was it about Mindful Chef that you thought could be successful, and what it was that you and Miles and Giles, your co-founders back then, were looking to achieve?
Hi. Well, thank you for the intro. Morning, everyone. So, 2015, the three of us knew each other. We talked about starting various businesses. We could never get that passionate about any of them until we sort of started thinking about food and, experiencing sort of selling direct from a fishing boat, sort of opened our eyes a little bit to this was a business that, we could conceptually understand how to start. And with, a fair amount of naive optimism, off we went to start a business from scratch without really knowing anything about what we were about to undertake. I think we always, used to sort of use the mentality of the Lean Startup book, which is a book by Eric Ries, and in that book, the whole premise of it is, iterate as quickly as possible, build feedback loops into your business, put things out into customers' hands that you'll later be embarrassed by because it's so early, and just try and use that hacky approach to saying, right, well, it's not perfect, but we'll put it in customers' hands, we'll see how they get on with it, and then we'll learn for the next thing. And I think that really ingrained us early as how we thought about starting a consumer business was, let's make sure that we don't miss that learn phase. Let's call our customers up. Let's go and do some deliveries to the best ones and, chat to them, understand what's important for them, what's not important for them. This is super early days. We used to put an hour aside each week, the three of us, to just pick up the phone and call customers. And it was a very, very painful hour. And I think if it was just me, I wouldn't have done it. I'd always have been too busy to just get round to that. But the three of us sort of forced each other to do it. And it gave us loads of insights in those early days of what was important to customers and what wasn't important to customers. And lots of startups I speak to these days seem to miss that missed that phase. They've got an idea about, a function that's, bit of functionality that's important, or a product range extension that's important, but they kind of miss any sort of feedback loop with the customers to actually validate that.
And what was it about? So when you set up Mindful Chef, you had probably an idea in your mind who your customer was going to be, who the sort of ideal consumer was. Through that sort of learning phase, and as the business grew, did that change? Who did the customer become, and did it sort of confound those expectations at the start?
Yeah, it's a good question. It changed a lot, actually. We started off as an organic service. We thought that's what would be important. We started off following a like Paleolithic diet, which was big in the US at the time. Turns out in the UK, nobody cared about it. Nobody cared about organic. They just, couldn't get their heads around the price point. But they did care deeply about the provenance of proteins and everything from animal welfare to, the sort of the quality of the eat. And they loved this provenance story. They loved the idea that it wasn't a faceless business. There were faces behind it. They felt that they were, speaking to a person. And I think increasingly we got the idea that, we could start to use the business as a force for good, and people would really buy into that. And sort of, as these guys talked about emotional loyalty, we started fairly early on, heavily loss-making startup, running community events and beach cleans, and we did our reverse advent calendar. We later, I think 2016, started our One Feeds Two program. So we started donating a school meal to children living in poverty for every meal that we sold. These were kind of things like early feedback of what brought customer loyalty. It was, well, the product's got to be good. I've got to feel like I like you guys and I trust you guys. And I also like this sort of wider community aspect. So it changed a lot over time. And I think, we just made sure that we kept talking to customers and kept understanding, what was important to them at any given time. Back in 2015, the sort of packaging wasn't the biggest problem point. It rushed into the Mind, sort of Blue Planet, all those things suddenly really became the biggest customer pain point. And as a result, lots of internal energy went on to improving that sort of impact as consumers told us it was important or not important.
And you sort of picked up on that point that Jonathan and Jan talked about, sort of building customer loyalty through community. Was that something that you sort of said accidentally happened, or were you aware very early that's what you needed to do and that's what you needed to make something to happen to make the business successful and retain customers longer term?
I think we looked at retention in two parts. One was around just delivering an amazing service for the right value points that people wanted to buy, but also trying, as you say, to create this wider community of people. Certainly at the time that we launched, the biggest kind of success stories in terms of driving popularity were Deliciously Ella and they were Joe Wicks. They were both people who were coming up, and they now, later on, they now have big product ranges and they're big businesses, both of them. But at the time, they were sort of bloggers, vloggers, and we very much tried to emulate that and be no, we do want a bit of a community. We do want people to think that they're buying from my two co-founders. I was always the silent partner. We had book deals and things which weren't there to make any money out of. They were just to try and cement ourselves as a bit of a probably a brand bigger than we were, quite frankly.
Yeah. And I mean, back my memory at least of it is back in 2015 in those early days, the subscription-based model was sort of in its infancy in the UK. It was sort of pretty well established in the US, but particularly for food and consumer brands, it was quite early days. And I think, I might be wrong, but I remember you saying with some of the earlier conversations you had with institutional investors, there was a sort of reluctance to believe that the subscription-based model could be sustainable and profitable long term. were you always confident that that model could translate well into this sort of business, and sort of what gave you that confidence?
Not always confident, no. I think customers have a difficult relationship with all subscriptions, quite frankly, and it's not really a subscription. It's almost like a sort of, we just create a next order for you. There's no annual commitment or anything like that. But still, I think the Holy Grail is really, you don't need a subscription. You can just, click the button when you need it and it arrives a few minutes later. That's kind of, that was a lot of the feedback that we got around the business model in question. I guess, how did we combat that? I mean, really through just building up the data of, we have a very good understanding of where we can acquire customers. And then, we've got a bit of a playbook on how we can build loyalty over time. And these are the unit economics of a customer. And obviously, there's always things that throw your unit economics out. You get kind of big inflation come through and suddenly your gross profit's being knocked, or meta changes and suddenly all of your acquisition costs are spiking. And so it's just about, reacting to those over time. And I'd say crucially, not forgetting to continually understand from your customer base what's actually important and what's keeping them loyal, because it does change over time.
And how do you do that as you grow? Because you sort of talked about early days, you could dedicate that time to pick up the phone to your customers and ask them those questions directly. Obviously, that becomes practically impossible as you grow. So how did you manage that process when the customer base became too big to have those direct conversations?
Yes, a good question. So I guess in terms of timeline, we were around the Piper investment, 2018, we were shipping about 8,000 boxes a week, probably a sort of £16 million a year business. Fast forward 18 months through the pandemic, we were doing 75 million of sales, nearly 40,000 boxes a week. We'd hired a lot of people, expanded our operation dramatically. Obviously, had an enormous customer base in comparison to what we did beforehand. And so it's a case of how do you stay in touch with customers? How do you systemize some of that feedback? For us, we started building feedback loops into the weekly idea of people coming to, select their recipes. We'd start to, bring it into the digital experience. So the first one was, fairly constant, like NPS polling. We'd be like monitoring Net Promoter Score on a weekly basis. Early on, 2016, we'd already built 3 bits of sort of feedback into our thing, which was all just like logging complaints essentially. But it gave us a lot of data on how well were we doing. We'd log every complaint against, ingredient quality. So anyone with problems there, delivery quality, recipe ratings. We later added scores around the digital experience, technology, and how satisfied people were with how we solved like customer care interactions through like a CSAT score.
Easy for you to say.
Yeah. Internally, we called those 5 things the moments that matter. So, and on a weekly basis, we would talk about these in front of, the whole team would sit like this, and we'd have up on the screen, how was NPS last week? How were recipe ratings? How did the operations team do? Are people engaged with that new technology feature, or are they confused by it? And it gave the whole business a very good pulse every week of how was it for customers, not last quarter or last year, how was it in the last few days? How did we get on? And it really allowed empowered the teams to go, whoa, I've got a problem here, like we're on it, So that's kind of how we did it. And I guess in a softer, like the softer side of that, that's the kind of the data-driven bit that it definitely added value to customers, us being on it, the buying team were kind of, if there was yellow coriander, they knew instantly. First 3 complaints coming in, oh, we've got a problem. Like, let's fix it immediately. And on the softer side of things, I don't know, we went from a business of 40 people to 140 people across, a little over 12 months. There were more people in the office, or not in the office, in the business, who had been there for less than 6 months than had been there for more than 6 months. And that's a big management challenge. And I think we were lucky enough to have established a set of values, both like mission statement to make healthy eating easy, and this set of values of how we interact with customers, suppliers, each other, that allowed this rapid new influx of team members to, hopefully operate like a founder would, without us having to be in every meeting and every conversation. They could kind of look back on it and go, our values were mindful, clues in the name, personal, which was all around, our first customers were friends and family, and that's how we wanted to treat them. And that's how we should always be thinking about any of our interactions. As soon as it starts feeling corporate, you say, well, you wouldn't send that to your mum, would you? Like, let's rein it back, pick up the phone, give them a call. And unafraid, because we was trying to do a few things, certainly with One Feeds Two and things like that were a little bit different from everyone else. And so that was a sort of encouragement to think like a startup, push the boundary. If it's hard, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And those two things combined, I think, having very accurate, lots of data points on, the customer experience on a weekly basis, and this strong value set that allowed lots of new people to interpret that and kind of think in the mindset that we would think of how to solve those problems, kind of really helped us scale fast. And, any startup that's hoping to, go on a fast trajectory, definitely having some of those things in place early on are mega helpful, because it's hard to put them in afterwards.
Yeah, I'm sure. And you sort of touched on at the start there about the pandemic, and obviously presented huge challenges for businesses across all sectors, but none more so than your sector. How did you use that challenge as a way of sort of creating opportunities for the business? How did you react? I think we approached the pandemic in a very different way to most other food businesses. At the time, you couldn't get a supermarket delivery slot. They were all just fully done, fully closed. HelloFresh had shut to new customers, Gusto had shut to new customers. And we sort of put our heads together and said, well, this doesn't feel like the right approach. Is that really what our customers want us to do? To just be a closed club? If you're in, you're in. If you're not, tough. And we almost did the opposite. We actually emailed all of our customer base and said, we're seeing quite a lot of demand and we want to try and stay open. So if people do need food delivered, we're able to deliver it. So as a result, we're going to make the following changes to the service, for everyone. We extended our lead times. We cut our menu in half, took all like difficult butchery off the menu because, butchers couldn't keep up, basically. And we warned them that there were going to be long wait times on emails, that there'll be lots of substitutions. If you're not bothered by them, just don't bother getting in touch, essentially. And we're going to try and stay open. And on top of that, if you work for the NHS, we're going to give you a third off. So whether you're an existing customer or a new customer, you're doing your bit, we're doing our bit. And I think it was, extremely well received by everyone. We turned lots of people into, we bought a lot of emotional loyalty that day, and people said, yes, I'm fully in this. And we turned, lots of those new customers and existing customers at the time, still customers today,
And that's when you ask them about it, they say, "Oh, it was back then. You were really a lifeline, and I got it. You know, I ordered this. You sent me something else. I didn't mind." You know.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I think sort of remembering that time and how hard that was for the business to do. So it wouldn't have been an easy decision to make because of the impact it had amongst the staff and so on. But yeah, building that customer loyalty, it definitely worked. I mentioned at the start the fact you've been a B Corp and a very proud B Corp, and I know it's something that you, when you're involved and everyone who's still in the business, take very seriously. There are, probably not in this room, but maybe some cynics who say B Corp it's a marketing tool. And obviously that is true, it is a good marketing tool. But beyond that, I'm sort of interested in your thoughts as to how, beyond it being a good marketing tool and reflecting the values you've got as a business, how do you think the framework that B Corp brings helps actually deliver growth and profitability within the business?
I think when we first opened the enormous B Corp sort of manual questionnaire application process, which would have been 2018, I think. Loads of it, everything from governance to being an equal opportunities employer, to lots of these things that are kind of almost like behind the scenes that customers don't really see them, but they live in the culture of your business. I was like, God, I wish we'd read some of this before. Like, we would have shaped things a bit differently. Like, there's lots of good framework in there. Obviously, by sort of gamifying it and giving it scores, if you're competitive like we were, it makes you think about them even harder. You know, and so I think even for businesses that say, "Oh, I'm not really that interested in paying B Corp to use their logo," which is what it is. It's a marketing trade-off of pay them 20 grand a year. We can call ourselves a B Corp. We can get a score. Are we likely to get more customers as a result, or are we likely to feel better as founders as a result? I think even just the having a read through some of the underlying framework is interesting for any stage business where they're at. You'll look at some areas and go, "Wow, we do nothing in that. We'd actually score really badly." In other areas, you'd go, "We're pretty good at that." In other areas, you'd say, "This is just totally inapplicable for the scale of my business. You know, we've only got one member of staff with a baby. Why would we have a creche?" Do you know what I mean? So it's some of the things are a bit like they don't apply to all businesses, but the framework is there for, and it's a good one.
Yeah. And so sort of fast forwarding a bit then, so I think it was in 2020, you ran a process and were looking to get investment or achieve an exit for some of the financial investors, and that brought along the Nestlé transaction, and just sort of wondering how that came about, what the process involved, and how you came to choose Nestlé as the partner for the business moving forward.
Yes, good question. So we were starting to fundraise in 2020, and then COVID hit. We put everything on pause. And then, the back end of that year, we were then back out looking for money. Mindful Chef had always been a fast growth, spend more money on marketing than, the payback of customers in any given short period. And we were growing fast as a result. And that was still the plan, basically, was to keep the foot on the gas, raise more VC money, and to sort of, potentially even take the business international, I think we were thinking about at that time. And there was really, did we need to fundraise? Yeah, we did need to fundraise, quite frankly. We had a business set up for high growth, and we ultimately were going to need capital at some point. The only two people that came back from that process were Waitrose and Nestlé, and both wanted options to acquire the whole business. I guess from a values perspective, the mission statement had always been to make healthy eating easy, and actually to have two kind of mega conglomerates interested kind of felt good in a way. We were like, these guys are going to help us, reach a far bigger audience with product and with Mindful Chef and everything else. There were nuances between the two deals, but ultimately we felt that Nestlé were going to be a better partner for us, mainly because they wanted to leave us alone.
Is that right?
And
I was going to ask sort of how that transition was to being part of this huge sort of global group, but was it sort of business as usual? Were you able just to get on with things?
I mean, for the most part, yes. There were, periods of, essentially financial engineering for them to deliver results, etc., which always felt bizarre to us, given we were just the tiniest minnow in their enormous business. But for the large part, they were true to their word, and they didn't touch our product or any of the day-to-day, how we were dealing with customers, the service they were getting, everything else. And they really focused our mind, I think, on how do we deliver a better business? What does a better business, look like for customers on this side of the chart we saw? And what does it look like for us? Well, for us, it means, how do we maximize essentially the unit economics of each customer? And for the customers, it means how, what are the recipe ratings doing? What's their NPS score doing? How delighted are they with the service that they receive each week? How do we cut down on all the little niggling quality problems, delivery problems, which when you ship 1 million fresh ingredients a week, you're going to have some. And through that framework that I talked about earlier, it really helped us kind of join the two together. And, we delivered a far, far better business 4 years later to full Nestlé ownership than back in 2020, both from a customer perspective. Ratings never been higher, NPS never been higher. Customers just loved it. All the problems, were far, far lower. And on the other side, customers were more loyal than ever before, spending more money with us, and we were making more money from them. So it was it was really interesting part of the journey. We had this early, really hacky stage, working hard, running out of money constantly, speaking to lots of customers, this huge scale up through the middle, through the pandemic, rapidly trying to put systems and processes in place for a bigger team. And then we really had this sort of optimization phase for the last few years, which was a bit more hamster wheel than we were used to. It took a while to kind of get into the mindset of optimization rather than newness and new growth and new everything. But it's been a really interesting journey, and I ultimately think Nestlé will be good stewards for the brand going forward. They're safe and boring, and they like things to just be consistent and to be around for in the next 100 years.
And I think it's a really interesting time for scaling D2C brands in the consumer sector, because a lot of the exit opportunities that people think are to people like Nestlé, Unilever, and so on. And these are value-led organisations who are scaling, often B Corps, and there are some people, perhaps, whether rightly or wrongly, who might have a slightly different perception of a Nestlé or a Unilever. Was that something that you were, particularly given you built this community, you've got sort of a following and a loyalty, were you, mindful's the wrong word, were you aware of the fact that, or were you conscious of the fact that that might be an issue amongst some of your customer base, and was it in reality at all?
Yeah, and I think, consumers don't like change. They like to sort of think that, a business that they love and they fall in love with isn't going to change. And probably these days it's, the influencers that they love and those sort of people, are they going to change as their followings get bigger or whatever? So there's always going to be people who are rocked by a public transaction, and see that as a negative thing, and instantly think, everything's going to change. I mean, I don't think the proof's in the pudding. The service hasn't changed at all; it's got better. But yes, there's always going to be a number of customers who don't like to see anything change, quite frankly. And I think we've probably done an exceptionally good job at feeling like a small business when actually we were quite a large business by the end.
Yeah.
And people still had that personal touch with founders and felt that they were still buying off the original founding team when actually there was a big team. We'd had a CEO, Tim, in place since 2018. So like there'd already been lots of change behind the scenes, but obviously a big public transaction gets people talking, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's like a different question, but sort of talking about engagement with customers, very customer-centric brand, and that was sort of driven by being primarily a direct-to-consumer business. Obviously, from the first few years, it was very much sort of recipe kits was the focus, and over time, you built that product range out to both selling other people's products through the Mindful Chef website, but also your own products like frozen meals, smoothies. So interested in that sort of transition, but also the move into retail with the frozen meals and how that came about, and also how that changed the sort of relationship with the customer and how you dealt with not having that direct interaction with them.
Yeah, good question. I think, the sort of expansion into other products had always been a plan. We used to think that this sort of weekly delivery into customers' homes was a bit of a Trojan horse. It was the box was already going, the costs had already been sunk. We already had this sort of loyalty, empathy built up with the customers, and they trusted us, and therefore to extend into other products was kind of, we had the authority to do it. And I'd say on the manufacturing of our own label stuff, it wasn't a core competency, I'd say. We got quite good at meal kits. Over the years, we've shipped millions of them. You sort of understand what works, what doesn't work. We had really good customer feedback that we got almost instantly that could feed the next generation of recipe development or product R&D. And with the other bolt-ons, it wasn't really like a sort of core competency. I think we found it a lot harder than we thought to build out some of these things. Where we did have great success was with partner brands, people that were really good at making products that we loved, and we could give them access to a really hyper engaged customer base. And that was a bit more of a win-win, really. They'd attract people to Mindful Chef. We'd probably lean on their, the mission to make healthy eating easy would kind of screen the types of products that we'd like to have on there.
Yeah. Sort of conscious Rachel's waving the 5-minute sign at me, I think for quite a while. I didn't notice it, so we're running out of time, but the obligatory sort of looking back, if you knew then what you know now, would you have done anything differently, and sort of advice to people who are either very early stages in scaling a D2C brand or are sort of a bit further ahead in the journey?
Yeah, I think the biggest bit of advice is just keep speaking to your customers, really. It's the easiest thing to not do at the end of a busy day. But if you can kind of ingrain it into the culture that's how you operate, and everyone should be doing it across a business, and whether you'll be collecting soft data points or doing more anecdotal feedback, it's just super important, and it keeps you sort of true to why people are buying a service, and ultimately will help you nudge towards that, the holy grail of people talk about your brand in a sort of ethereal state that they love, that they're going to be heartbroken if it's, there's a change of shareholder, which is totally irrational. And so, but that's the kind of level that you want to build. But if you don't understand their motivations for buying it and what keeps them loyal, you won't have a hope.
Well, that ties in nicely to what Jonathan and Jan were saying. I think that's it. Thank you very much. I hope everyone found that really interesting.